Welcome, fellow wizards, to the Indie Game Lunch Hour. Today we're talking with Gabriel Cornish about risk versus reward in game design.
The Indie Game Lunch Hour.
Wow. In our live magical podcast, we give game developers the chance to hear stories of breaking into the industry from industry experts, as well as directly ask them questions about their areas of expertise in the second half of each episode. In this this is an unedited weekly event we host on our Discord, Wednesdays at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, so feel free to swing by and join us for the next one. Ask your own questions live. As always, I'm your host, Willem Delventhal, the headmaster of this wonderful magical school, the Indie Game Academy, and the Wizard of Joy. And joining me today is a good friend of mine, Gabriel Cornish. I work with Gabriel actually at Paradox Tectonic, which is a subsidiary of the parent company Paradox Interactive. We're currently working on a life sim game together. It's been a lot of fun, and I've already learned a lot from Gabriel. Gabriel, welcome to the show. What are you having for lunch today?
Today, well, I just had a bowl of oatmeal with blueberries and a nice cup of coffee.
Heck yeah, that sounds healthy.
Yeah. It's a good way to start the morning.
Breakfast of Champions. You're getting the inside scoop already. Interestingly, oatmeal is actually my go-to breakfast every single day. I feel like it started as a depression era meal during the difficult times financially, and then I just kept eating it.
Solid. It's a genuinely solid breakfast.
Yeah. It's pretty tasty. It's super cheap. It's extremely healthy. Good choice.
Yeah,
Good choice.
Exactly.
Well, Gabe, it's awesome to have you on the show. I really do genuinely feel, as I've said now a couple times, that I've already learned a lot from my time working with you and working at Paradox at large. It's been wonderful to be a part of a design team. Last time I was working as a designer, I was on my own, and that can be rewarding, but also really challenging. And so it's just been wonderful to learn. I would love to hear, I think this is always our first question. This is where we start. I'd love to hear your origin story, Gabriel. So how did you get started in games, and how did you get to where you are now?
I started in games. I feel like I started later than most people. Like, I didn't start making games until I was almost done with college.
What?
I had kind of like a midlife crisis in my 20s because I wasn't really particularly thrilled with my choice of major for college. So I got to the end of college and I saw
Wait, what were you studying before? We have to know.
I was in marketing.
Nice.
And I started to look at, what are the kinds of jobs that I was going to be able to get. And I started to panic. And I'm like, no, I can't do any of this. And at the time, it was kind of right around Indie Game the movie came out, and then I had a friend, John, shout out to King Fanta, who was making Flash games and selling them to Adult Swim and Congregate and all that. And I was like, oh man, you can make these things, right? You can make a living making these things. So I think it was my senior year of college. I started to learn, programming and Unity and all that kind of stuff, and just started making some games and putting them out there. I ended up getting an internship with this gaming adjacent startup. So it wasn't like I was making games. I was working for a startup in marketing that was making middleware kind of multiplayer leaderboards for mobile games. And so it wasn't exactly what I wanted to do, but at least I was kind of adjacent to that.
Yeah.
Right?
You're on the other side of the door, at least. You're listening
exactly. Yeah, I'm listening in. And it was actually great because, I got to go to GDC and go to all the industry events and talk to a lot of developers and stuff like that. And so it got me in around the people that I wanted to be around. And then all the while I was just doing a bunch of game jams and just putting a bunch of games on the internet. And I think itch was just starting to be a thing. I was just making games and putting them out there, just making and sharing. Then my friend John, who he had been making those Flash games. I think he saw some of the games that I've been putting out there. He said there was an opportunity at his company for a game designer. And and then it kind of just spiraled out of control from there. I became an addict. I was just a game development crack addict. I just couldn't stop making games, and I got my foot on the door, and it's kind of been history from there.
Awesome. Yeah. So for reference, the Gabe has worked on a number of different titles, but recently, before this last job, he was working at Jam City, where he worked on Twist, I think was the name of the narrative game you have
Yeah.
listed. Yeah. And then more famously, one of the more well-known titles is Hogwarts or Harry Potter Hogwarts Mystery, where Gabe was in charge of making the Quidditch racing game and a couple of other things.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think it's really cool. I think perhaps you have told me this before, but it's a really wonderful thing that I am confident is already helping people and making people feel a little bit more comfortable, that you started outside the industry and switched in a little bit later. We find that actually perhaps the biggest subset, but at least the second biggest subset of people that we work with at the Indie Game Academy is career transitioners, who tend to be older. They tend to be, in fact, they tend to be older than you were even. They tend to be like 26 to 36. And so that time period of like going, I'm not really happy with what I am doing. I think I want to work in games, can be really challenging. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that, I guess, before we go anywhere else. What was it like making that career transition? And do you have any advice for people who are in a similar boat?
Yeah. I mean, I think, excuse me. I think, especially like if you're trying to get into game design, having experience outside of game development, like it's one of those like roles where if you're coming from something completely different, you can still take advantage of that experience and bring it into your game design. So, whether you're coming from, a completely different field, there's something that you probably learned in that job that is applicable to game design in some way. It's one of those like disciplines that you can literally learn anything and it's like tax deductible.
I write up so much stuff, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. It's like you can go down any like rabbit hole, right? Like, I mean, I think about like Will Wright, he was just like fascinated with ants and just made a whole game about ants, right? Like, it's so I think if you're coming from a different industry, I personally would look at it as more of a strength than a weakness. If you're going into the game design, I think for me particularly, the advice is always like, make games, right? Just make games. And I think it's generally good advice, right? If you want to be in the game industry, like you do need to be making games. But it's also like I found like not super helpful advice, right? Because it's one of those pieces of advice that just breeds more questions. It's like, okay, we'll just make games. Well, like, what kind of games do I make? What engine do I use? Should I be making this genre of game or should I be making that genre of game? So I do think that there are better ways to approach the just make games advice that I think will help you, will like create a solid foundation for you to enter the game industry.
That is disheartening because that's the advice we give like all the time. So help us expand upon this advice then. Give us a couple of those questions. I am a career transitioner and boy howdy, I'm so scared of the game industry right now because it just looks bad. How do I transition, Gabe? What do I do?
How do you transition? So, I mean, first of all, just make games is good advice, right? I just don't think it's like complete advice. So like if you're just getting started, I think the setting a strong foundation for game development starts with finishing projects, right? And so I think that's why like game jams are so critical to any game developer, because essentially all a game jam is a theme and a deadline, right? And now we normally think about game jams from the perspective of it's like 48 hours or something like that. But I believe that a game jam can be like a 3-month game jam, right? So long as you stick to the deadline and you have a general theme, like, just doing that process over and over again, kind of whatever slots into your life. I'm recently a dad, so I don't have the energy.
Congrats.
Thank you. I don't have the energy or ability to, just shove pizza pockets down my throat and like drink Mountain Dew and like do a coding storm for 48 hours, right? Like my game jams are a little bit longer, a month, 2 months, 3 months, whatever I can slot into kind of my busy schedule. But having a practice of just constantly making things and then putting them out there, like that's just a process, right? But if you're just starting out, I think, it's helpful to make games starting from, the early 80s and 70s and then like working your way up, right? So it's like if you've never made a game
That's
before,
cool.
start with Pong, right? And this is actually a practice that I still do. Every time I'm learning a new engine, I just make Pong, right? Because if you think about it, like Pong has a lot of the fundamental things that you're going to need to know that just kind of don't go away. You're going to be dealing with input controls. You're going to be dealing with drawing graphics to the screen. You're going to be dealing with collisions. You're going to be dealing with scores. You're going to be dealing with win states and lose states, right? Like these are things that like games still have to this day, right? Like, so if you've never made a game before, always my recommendation is just make Pong, right? It seems like it's very simple and maybe too simplistic, but I think if you get good at making Pong, then you're setting yourself up with a really good foundation for the fundamentals of game development. And then from
That's
there,
really
it's
cool.
actually, oh yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, you keep going.
From there you can evolve Pong. If you just like flip it vertically, now you have like Brick Breaker, right? Like you can transition to that, which then kind of increases new mechanics. And then from Brick Breaker, you're essentially like learning how to design on a grid, right? So once you've learned how to design on a grid, then you can start working with RPG mechanics, right? You can start moving into creating levels. So you can start transitioning into Pac-Man, which now you're getting into the 80s. And then from there, you can start, getting into 3D, which is like, take a PS1 game that, or an N64 game that you're kind of really like excited about and try to recreate that or elements of that. And so, like I said, I think it still comes back to just make games, right? But having kind of like this progression that is going to teach you kind of the fundamental mechanics that you're going to be reusing over and over again in your career, I think is a little bit more guided, right?
That's really cool. I have never heard advice quite like that. And I think it's wonderful, starting from the early beginnings of game development all the way up to the modern day. I love that both as like an actual practice exercise where you are escalating how complicated each of these titles is, but then you are also just like what a cool conceptual concept. You're moving through different games from the past and experiencing the evolution of gaming. I love that. I think we tend to advise that you do like a step program basically where the thing that's escalating is the scope. So you're working on a 2-day game or a couple of day game, and then you're escalating it up to like a week long, and then 2 weeks, and then a month. And so it follows a similar curve of learn your lessons early, fail on something that's less important, and then escalate into something that's more committed. But people still ask me like, well, what the hell game should I actually make? And I think this is a great progression. I love this. That's awesome.
And I think that progression also is really great, the 2-day to a week to like a month, and so forth, because it sounds counterintuitive, but it's actually easier to make a game on a shorter time frame than it is to make a game on a longer time frame. And my theory on this is because you have less of that middle, which I call like the development desert, where it's like the excitement of the initial idea is gone and the end is like not like there's no light at the end of the tunnel. So you're just in this desert. And the longer that desert is, the harder it gets to try to like actually complete a game. Yeah. So I think that like idea of like, start with like a 2-day project, right? That desert is going to be much smaller than if you're like working on a 6-month project or a year-long project.
Yeah, I don't remember if it was you, but somebody recently said the same thing where the middle is the hardest to me. I think maybe it was Nathan Kelman, who podcast listeners may know. Regardless, the concept that like the beginning is really easy because you're excited, you're pumped up, and the stuff you have to make is like pretty straightforward. Like, all right, I got to add the input. All right, I got to add the character. And every time you add something, it's a significant change. It's like, oh man, now my character can run. Oh man, now I have a boss fight. Like, oh, so exciting. And the end is exciting and easy because you're like, whew, releases so soon. You might
Right.
you might get into crunch mode, which is its own complication, but
Right.
ultimately, like, it's there, you can taste it. But that middle of like, all right, the input still doesn't feel that good. Let me try twiddling these values again. That freaking bug popped up again. I don't get why it's still happening. Like, that period where the end is not yet in sight and all the exciting stuff is done is so much harder than I think a lot of people know about until they get there.
It's brutal. It's just work. It's just straight work. Like
Yeah.
that's it. That's all I can describe it. It's just work.
You're going to meet Rick in a second. Rick is in the audience right now, and he is a beloved member of our community. He actually teaches our level 2 programs and a really smart guy, startup founder. But also, he's our chief question asker. He will ask you like probably 16 questions today.
Oh,
And
awesome.
in the in the comments, he said, let's see, I'm trying to find it. He had a great comment earlier. Okay, I'm spending too long on this, but he said some good stuff that now I'm forgetting. It's fine. Oh, there it is. All right. If you do, as you get older, especially when you get into like 25-year plus age, you start to realize that any life path that you could choose is hard, has its own complications, its own difficulties. And so you might as well choose one that you actually enjoy doing. I think that's very true. Game development is still a job. There's still days like, as far as it goes, me and you have it made, Gabriel. But there's still days where I'm like, oh, I don't want to go work with a bunch of cool
Yeah.
people, on a cool project. Like, oh, dang, I have to like input
Yeah.
stuff today. But I think every game you make helps that process be a little bit more manageable, and it helps you understand how to manage it and how you best manage it, and how you best keep yourself on task. And also, games are dope, and I would still always do them.
Yeah. I always joke, like, I think I'm completely and utterly unemployable outside of this industry. Like, I wouldn't cut it anywhere else, I don't think.
Me too. I have like so many. I feel like pampered sometimes. I'll still like complain now and then, but oh well. So
Yeah.
let's get to the topic of the day. So this is, I think, been a great introduction, especially for people who are feeling uncertain, and especially for those career transitioners. So thank you for that. Um, the topic of the day, though, is risk versus reward in game design. And you have been one of the people that I enjoy talking game design with the most because you always have something to say. So I would love, before I taint the conversation at all, just give us an introduction. You proposed that topic. So what does it mean? What is risk versus reward in game design?
Right. So I think try to back into this from a slightly different perspective. Like, I think risk versus reward is one of those fundamental elements of game design that I think starts to allow a designer to look at designing a game from first principles.
Mm-hmm.
I think the marriage between risk and reward in games like runs really, really deep. Almost every game that you have probably enjoyed in your lifetime has an element of risk and reward in it. So I'm not going as far as to say that risk and reward is like the equivalent to fun, but I am saying that the fun games that you have played have an element of risk and reward in it. I mean, there is an entire city in the state of Nevada that is built off of this one thing alone. If you go to if you go to Las Vegas, you see millions of people and like billions and billions of dollars being poured into risk and reward in gaming. But I mean, even if you look at things like Dungeons and Dragons, or like the core mechanic there is literally risk and reward. You are taking actions and taking risks, hoping that they succeed. And the gameplay, a lot of the time, I mean, narrative aside, like if you're just looking at the straight mechanics, is about kind of mitigating and improving the odds of that risk you're taking whenever you're like casting a spell, or attacking, or looking or for a treasure, or trying to spot traps and stuff like that. So I I think that's my premise. That's my pitch. I think risk and reward runs really deep. There is a beautiful marriage there in games, and I think looking at it from that perspective, I think can give you some insights into how to strengthen some of your designs.
I love that. Risk versus reward, definitely one of the key sort of like tools, I guess, of a game designer, and it gets used all over the place. So Gwen just posted to the chat, for instance, a picture of the starting screen on Slay the Spire. If anybody has played Slay the Spire, at the beginning of every run, you get a choice of one boon slash curse or negative that you can get among a couple of different choices. That's a great example of a risk versus reward. Or I was playing Kingdom 2 Crowns the other day, and there's it's a little tiny city builder, kind of kingdom builder. And there's a merchant that will occasionally approach your town who you have to pay, but he'll come back later and give you a bunch of coins. That's a perfect example of risk versus reward, because in that game, where you spend your coins is like very carefully thought out, and you can really screw yourself if you spend it in the wrong place. Right. So absolutely, why don't you give us I love breaking down the lessons from this show into applicable pieces. So something that a listener could literally take and then put in their game. So risk versus reward, yes, definitely, but it's a bit broad. Can you give me some more specific examples of something something a developer could add to their game that allows them to practice this risk versus reward application?
Right. So I think risk versus reward, I think one way to look at it is it's kind of like an iceberg, right? Like risk versus reward sits kind of at the top, like above the level. Like that's kind of the end result. But really, it's built up of components underneath it, and it drills down all the way to, I think, the core of what makes video games video games. So if you look at risk versus reward, the component that kind of builds on that is decision making, right? Because inherent in risk versus reward is this idea that you have to make a decision. Am I going to take this risk or am I not going to take this risk, right? If you're forced to take that risk, it's not really a risk. It's just you just have to do it, right? So it implies that there is a decision, right? And a decision implies that the player, have some kind of autonomy. You can do something. So going back to the practicality, and this is going to be my clickbait headline, the one question a designer can ask to absolutely level up their game design skill.
Nice.
One of the things that I see a lot of beginner entry-level designers do is they tend to ask themselves, if they have to develop a feature or a level or whatever, they're looking at it from the lens of, what are the rules, right? A good example is, if you have to put a door in a game, right? Beginner designers are usually looking at it from the perspective of okay, well, what color is the door? What's the tech for the door? What's the size of the door? What are the inputs? That kind of stuff. But I argue that I think as you get more experience in game design, you drop that what are the rules question and you start asking what can the player do, right? And I think it's a much more powerful way of looking at designing a feature or even a game is, you take that the same example of the door, right? A different way of looking at it is okay, well, the player can kick the door down. The player can open it. The player can peek through it. The player can attach a sticky bomb to it and explode it, right? That, I think, gets at the heart of what this medium is about, which is interactivity. Gameplay is about what the player can do, the verbs. And then from there, looking at, okay, well, what are the rules to be able to implement this? That kind of ties back into risk and reward because the risks you're taking, right, in the game are inherently going to be tied to the things that the player can do. Again, using the door as an example, kicking it is a thing that I can do, right? And so if I wanted to think about what is the risk reward for kicking in a door, maybe there is an ally on the other end, and if I kick the door down, I knock out the ally, right? But the reward is I can get through, a level faster or something like that, right? Attaching a sticky bomb to a door to explode it again, maybe I can get through that door quicker. because I don't have to go out and find a key or something. But who knows? Maybe there's innocent people on the other end of it, right? Like, again, in order to be able to create risk and reward decisions in your game, you have to look at the game from the perspective of what can the player do? What are the player actions? What are the verbs that the player can do? And then how can I take those verbs and inject drama into it so that they're interesting and engaging? And that's essentially kind of what the purpose for me is of risk and reward, is injecting interesting decisions into your game.
I love that. Here's a follow-up question, a simple one. Is the satisfaction of watching the door explode a reward?
It absolutely can be, right? Like it can totally be a reward, right? Like, and also I think that the nice thing is anything can be a reward, right? So long as it's satisfying enough, or it's something that the player is looking forward to or anticipating.
I love that. Yeah, and I think something that's implied is the risk versus reward. You as a developer, you as a designer, when you're creating these potential moments for a player to engage in, the risk versus reward does not, and I would argue probably should not, be the same between the potential options. So maybe you blowing up the door actually is not good. And it winds up triggering an alarm, and a bunch of people show up, and you get shot or whatever, and you lose the game.
Right.
It has that reward moment of blowing up the door, maybe, but you have air quotes here, lost the risk versus reward gamble that you took. That's okay. The player actually expects some of that, because otherwise, I think the choice is not meaningful.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think, for a choice to be meaningful, the player has to have some idea of the consequences that can result from that choice, right? That forward thinking is, I think, the core of what makes it meaningful, right? So yeah, like if I blow up a door, yeah, I'll probably set off some alarms, right? Like that is a reasonable thing a player could think. But
especially if it's like a stealth game or alarms have been pre-established, or
yeah, exactly. But I also do think that, for every action that you do in the game, there should be a reason to do it, right? So yeah, maybe the reason is you just want to see something explode, but ideally, that reason is tied some way into progressing you towards an outcome that you're looking for. I think one of the best feelings that at least I have in games is when I have that oh, what have I done moment, right? Because it is a direct result, the consequences are a direct result of the choices that I've chosen to make previously. And it's such a powerful emotion, that what have I done? I think that all kind of comes back to looking at game design from the lens of what can the player do.
Player action. I love that. That's awesome. So I'm going to ask one final question, and then we're going to get to community questions. And I'm stealing this final question from the community, actually. Rick, thank you for this question. Rick asks, what are your favorite risk versus reward mechanics that you've seen implemented? So what are some specific risk versus reward moments that we might incorporate into our games?
I mean, honestly, I think my favorite risk versus reward mechanic is just the D20 mechanic from D&D. It's so timeless, right? I think the moments that I remember so fondly in games is, when you're around with your friends around a table, and there's a really high stakes moment, and you or a buddy just decides to do something absolutely insane with a very low chance of success, but you're like, no, this is going to be cool if I pull it off. And so you take the D20, you anticipate chucking it, and then that silence that kind of hushes over the table as you're waiting to see the result, and then whether it's success or failure almost doesn't matter. It's that moment between knowing whether your risk has paid off or not. That is, I think, the true magic. And so again, yeah, I would say one of my favorite risk reward mechanics is the D20 mechanic in D&D, or other kind of RPGs, because in it there is so much possibility for creating long-lasting experiences and memories in games.
That's awesome. I love that as a concept. It was such it's so funny how in Baldur's Gate 3, just a D20, rolling a D20. You know, how long did that take them in a program? Like 15 minutes. Um,
Right.
that's this like novel addition to the RPG genre. Like the where it all began is a new fresh feature and mechanic.
Right.
Um, but it's true, it works well. Like dice work well, man. I like
Right.
some of the other ones. I've been playing, as always, a lot of Slay the Spire. Gabe just sent a recent game by the people who made Slay the Spire, who another game they created during a game jam that was kind of fun. But the simple map layout in Slay the Spire, which gets used in a bunch of other games. We've seen it in FTL, a number of other sort of roguelikes, where you can choose a path and you knowingly are choosing a path given certain information. So something may be more difficult. There's probably a greater reward over here, but maybe that means I'm going to run into elite. That's one of my personal favorite risk versus rewards. I have lost so many Slay the Spire runs because I had like 7 health, but I knew I could probably kill this elite. And if I did, I was going to get a relic, which is super powerful. So I'm going to go for it. And then I died. And well,
Right.
that was my fault. I guess the run's over. That's one of my favorite. That's one of the reasons I still play Slay the Spire. That simple map
Yeah.
layout and the choice of where to go.
Slay the Spire is excellent at this. There's so many times in that game where you just like compelled to push your luck,
Yeah.
like that. And that, I think that map has a lot to do with it, right? It's like, the odds are stacked against you, and like in the back of your mind, like, this is probably not the best decision I should be making, but I'm gonna do it anyways. Like I feel like luck is on my side. I can do this. Like, and then if it blows up, it's fine, right? You're like, okay, yeah, I knew I made a poor decision, right? Like, obviously this is what I get. But if it succeeds, oh my gosh, it's even like better, right?
That
Like
one time out of
you're on
20.
cloud nine. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't remember the name of the move for the Ironclad character that uses health to do damage.
Mm.
Uh, but that one, there's definitely been a couple of games I've lost because I was like, I shouldn't take another one of these, but I'm gonna.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. It is now time for community questions. I've stolen enough of Gabe's time. Thank you, everybody. Let's bring Rick up onto the stage. Rick, would you like to ask the first community question of the day?
Yeah, thanks. So I was looking at your bio for the event here, and you've made over 100 games and prototypes. That is an immense number and impressive by any standard, even at Jamscopes. So I'm curious, what's your favorite way to get the ball rolling on an idea?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. I wish there was like a definitive answer, because I think it changes a lot. Sometimes like it's just, there's just like a mechanic that I want to explore. Sometimes I'm inspired by a screenshot of something, and I just want to recreate that screenshot as a game. I call that the start with art approach, which I think is a valid approach. But a lot of times I think I'm just hacking other people's designs, right? Like I'll see a game, or I'll play someone's game jam, or I'll see something on itch, and I'm like, oh, that's really cool. Like, can I retheme that? Or can I like make that that same mechanic, but like strip out like 3 different elements, right? I think that's actually maybe my favorite approach, is to take a mechanic, an existing mechanic, and see if I can like strip it down to its bare bones and remove things so that I just get to the core of what makes that thing fun. But yeah, I think there's a lot of ways to get the ball rolling. I think the easiest way is to copy. It's to see something that inspires you, and then to just try to recreate a portion of it, right? The beautiful thing about copying, especially if you're not trying to go off and like, claim it as your own, is that you can't really like copy something perfectly, right? You can't copy someone else's work perfectly. And the imperfections in you copying someone else's work is essentially your style. And so it's a good way of like starting to learn like what your own unique take is. I forget the quote. It was like, the difference between drawing a perfect circle and like, a crooked circle is essentially like your style, right? So everybody's going to draw a circle differently. So I think once you start learning how to essentially draw your own circle, you're going to start, I think, coming up with more ways to build on other people's work.
Cool, thanks. It sounds like you are focusing in, like you pick something that you want to focus in as your pivot point for your project, and then you just find a way to orbit around that.
Right.
Cool.
Another like, I guess it all depends on your goals too, right? Like, I think a lot of times, like I'll take on projects because I just want to learn something that I haven't done before. So, one thing that I think I used to do early on is I would look through, when I was trying to break in, I would look through job listings for game design roles that I knew I had no shot at. And then I would look at what their requirements were, and then I would build a project around that.
Ooh,
right.
Yeah.
So then I could just say like, okay, I can do a portion of this. I have some experience in this thing that this job listing is asking for.
Nice. Thanks.
That's fantastic advice. That second part in particular, I really like. It is so many people will ask me what technical skills they should be studying, and my answer is usually like, look at the job descriptions for the jobs you want and do those skills. And you can absolutely like gain enough knowledge to at least sound competent pretty quickly.
Right.
You don't need to be an expert, and don't lie and say you're an expert, but you can definitely become competent pretty quickly. All right, so the next question that I have is from John Haig. John is not going to come up on stage simply because he doesn't have a mic, so I'm going to read this one for him. John asks, how do you battle with getting a game completed versus knowing the game is not perfect?
That is a lifelong battle. I think that is a battle that Willem, we fight every day, right? Like, I think as game developers, we want something to be perfect. I think the best piece of advice that I have come across is that vision will always be ahead of execution. What's in your mind is always going to be better than what you're capable of. And it should be that way. Because as your abilities get better and better, your vision also kind of stays ahead of it. And so you're kind of always chasing that image in your mind that is, better than what you can do. And so I think the sooner you accept that what's in my mind is always going to be more perfect than what I can actually do, the quicker you can kind of just get on with the work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really hard one. I totally agree. It's a lifelong pursuit. There's a famous quote that I went looking for the author, and it's one of those quotes that is like seemingly an amalgamation of what 15 different people said about something else. Like the original quote was apparently about poetry, I think. But the quote is, "A game is never finished; it is only abandoned." And I think that's like a perfect quote. Game development is not about creating a perfect game. No professional job that you will ever work, and probably no unprofessional job that you will ever work, will have as much time as would be required to create every feature you've ever imagined. Because there will always be something else you could add, and at some point you just got to say, okay, I'm done now.
Right.
And there's no perfect point along the line to stop. I would just say what I've been a fan of doing lately, especially for growth projects, for learning projects, is setting the time box before you ever begin and sticking to that time box religiously. So even if you get to the end of your time box, so just a due date. Even when you get to the end of your due date and you don't have half the game, it's a lot smaller game than you originally designed. Amazing. Release it.
Right.
And that's just a great skill to practice on its own. And then there's no more decision. That's just when it's due.
Yeah, I love that approach. And I wholeheartedly agree with that approach. It is the game jam approach, really, right? Like you're setting a fixed deadline on something, because when you do that, you're essentially saying, how much of my time is worth this one thing, right? How much of my time am I willing to invest in this project, right? And you're saying that up front, as opposed to, I think a lot of people get stuck in this loop of not releasing games because the amount of time that they could theoretically invest in it is infinite, right? There hasn't been set a limit. And so I think taking the approach of fixed time, variable scope, not only allows you to finish things, but it also teaches you how to scope your work and start scoping it down to a point where then you can achieve quality, right? I think players will always enjoy a smaller experience that is well polished than a larger one that is kind of just like, a mess.
Yeah, I tell this is a personal anecdote, but I think it's a great example of exactly this. I joined a global game jam a couple of years ago, where we had, this was before pre-pandemic, before the dark times. And we were at an actual office. We were at one of Google's offices, and a bunch of people, 50 or so people were in there, and I think there were like 15 to 20 teams all making games. And the local office decided to do a competition where the teams would actually get up and showcase their games at the end. And the team that won got a old school smartwatch before smartwatches were actually cool. And we wound up winning, which was very fun and satisfying. But our game was basically just Flappy Bird except a surfboard. But it was polished to hell. We had input working by the end of the first night, like within 4 hours. Like you could play the game then. And then we just spent the rest of the time polishing. And it was just a sleek, really fun, tiny experience. Versus some of the other people pitching their games. Like one dude I remember in particular basically had the entire like Legend of Zelda Wind Waker overworld where it's this giant, beautiful, roiling sea and you're like a boat on the sea. But that was it. That was all he had. Big, beautiful sea and a boat that could move along it. And that was it. And that's not a complete game or a satisfying experience. And so our little crappy Flappy Bird clone that was polished to the nines, wound up winning.
Yeah.
And I just think that's small and polished, better than big and unfinished.
Yeah. If you have 48 hours to do a game jam, spend the first 4 hours making the game and then the next 44 just polishing it.
Yeah. That's the equivalent of like
really
sharpening
solid.
the axe. Yeah,
exactly.
Awesome. All right. I've made Christy wait a very long time. Christy's been very patient. Christy, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. First, thank you so much, Gabriel, for sharing with all of us like this really super valuable like wealth of information. So my question, there was a lot of fantastic answers in the comments already, but my question is, as someone who struggles writing, understanding like coding logic and implementing that code in Engine, is there an easiest language for me to start learning that is still applicable to the gaming industry? And so far I've dabbled only in C# because I've only used Unity. And then I'll add also to that question, as like an aspiring narrative designer, is there an easiest language best suited for me to learn for my particular vertical?
Right. That's so. I think my advice may be a little bit of bad advice, right? Like, because my approach to learning programming and scripting and all that kind of stuff is entirely utilitarian, and that I personally believe that you should use whatever tool allows you to get what's in your head onto the screen. So if that means you're, using drag and drop, code editors, or, like using Scratch to make a game, or the programming, I think the programming skills, unless you're trying to be an engineer, right? Okay, so I should probably preface that. Unless you're trying to be a programmer, I think the programming matters less than your ability to make the game a reality, right? So I guess my advice is find any tool that allows you to make the game that you want to make, that works for you, and that allows you to make it in an intuitive way, and then make the game. And because I think if you're trying to be a designer or a narrative designer, that I think is going to go a lot further than if you're like, well, I need to learn C# specifically because that's what the industry wants me to learn. And so, I just need to do it that way, but it doesn't click for me. It's harder for me. It doesn't jive well. There's going to be a lot more friction there, which then means you're probably, going to have a harder time making your game, which then, that's probably not, what you'd want. So yeah, in summary, use the tool that allows you to make your game, and then and get that game into players' hands. And as far as the narrative design side of it, I think it depends on kind of what you're trying to do, but obviously I think Twine is an amazing tool. I used that for a long time to write out narratives for various games. Ink from the Inkle Studio is a great language to learn. It's built for writers in mind. So yeah.
Nice.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for the question, Christy. I think to tack onto that one additional point, programming language that works for you, yes, or just engine or whatever tool that lets you build the game is the one you should use. I think that's a great sentiment. The part that I would tack onto that is, and whatever methodology gets the game on the screen is also the way you should go. I remember at the very beginning, I didn't care about this, but I pretty quickly reached a point of inaction where I was like trying to figure out the best way to do everything because I really wanted to grow my skills. And that's maybe a valuable exercise, but it's far more important to just get the thing working. And by making things work in a terrible way, you'll eventually learn to do it in a better way.
Yeah, players don't really care how you made the game. They just care about the game.
Is game fun?
Yeah, is game fun? Am I enjoying myself? So a made game is best game.
Yes. Yeah, I've used this quote a lot as well. This is my mom. I can confidently attribute it to her. Done is beautiful. That's it. Yeah. Finished is good. All right, Dylan, would you like to ask your question?
Absolutely. Okay. So when we're talking about risk and reward, how can we make it so that the risks and rewards in a strategy game make it so that the player feels strategic and intelligent and in control, even though there's potentially random chance involved?
Yeah. So I think, when it comes to risk and reward, I think strategy, when it comes to risk and reward, I think a lot of it is going to hinge on the player's ability to understand the long-term consequences of that risk, right? Because if the player takes a risk and knows like, oh yeah, this risk could come back to haunt me, or I will determine the success in like 3 moves from now, then immediately you start thinking about, okay, well, if it goes this way, then I'll do this, and if it goes that way, then I'll do it. And then that's when you start getting into strategy. As far as luck goes, I think risk, though I think there's an element of luck in risk, I don't necessarily think that those two things are like tied together, right? Like, so take like, a Mario jump across like a large gap, right? Like that's a risk that the player is going to take. And it's not because that, it's a risk that is entirely in their control in terms of skill. The luck is coming from how well the player is skilled, or how skilled enough is the player to actually make that jump. So I think if you're trying to mitigate luck when it comes to, maybe a strategy or tactics game with risk and reward, then a lot of the risk and reward is going to come down to the level of difficulty for executing something and how skilled the player is in being able to execute that. So doing something that is harder is going to inherently be riskier than doing something that is easier. But the rewards also should kind of proportionally match the level of difficulty.
That's a great
hopefully
point.
That made sense, and hopefully I answered your question.
I think in addition, or just an additional example that you made me think of is just predetermined narratives as well, where there is a faux risk, like the narrative is determined. If you click this option, this will happen. That's how the game designer did it, period. There's no random chance. But to the player, it feels like there may be, or they don't know that there may be. And then I think Surya made a point in the comments that I think is a good one to call out here that you are alluding to and suggesting, which is he says, I think making risk and reward transparent to the player makes the game feel more fair. Players will still groan if they lose, but they won't blame the game because they chose the risks. So, for instance, Slay the Spire, for the most part, when you choose anything that is random chance, it tells you exactly what your odds are. So it doesn't just say, there's that random event that like does damage to you, but you might find a relic. It doesn't just say, hey, lose some health, maybe you'll find a relic. It says you have a 100% chance of taking damage and a 25% chance of finding a relic. Do you do it? And that I think works really well for a strategy game, especially. But anything where you want the player to feel like they are fully informed and yeah, the risk versus reward I think is more satisfying in general when it's more transparent.
Yeah, that's such a wonderful point, because the predicate to a good risk reward choice is being able to make an informed choice. And one of the best ways to make an informed choice is to make sure that the risks and the potential consequences of that choice are transparent.
Yeah. Yeah, if I had been playing a big run and gun and we got to that door we were talking about and I threw a C4 on the door and then an alarm went off, I'd be like, what the hell? Like, this is a game about blowing stuff up. But if I instead was doing a stealth game and I blew up a door and an alarm went off, I'd be like, yeah, that probably was a bad choice. That's my bad.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. All right. We are pretty much at the end of the day. I'm going to squeeze in one last question. Gwen is up on stage waiting patiently. Gwen, would you like to ask the last question of the day?
Yeah, when risks don't pay off for the player, how do you make that feel fair and not feel like arbitrary punishment?
Mm-hmm. Right. Again, I think it comes back to the player being able to make an informed decision, right? So when the player is taking a risk, the player should know the potential consequences of that risk, right? So that when they choose it, they know, okay, this is an outcome that is possible, or this is the negative outcome that is possible. So that when that negative outcome happens, they were already kind of primed for it, right? Whereas like if they take, a risk on something and then a completely unrelated negative consequence happens that comes out of the blue and doesn't make any sense, right? It's just kind of random. I think that's going to feel a lot worse, right? Because it divorces that consequence from the choice that they made. Again, it's kind of like, a good risk reward consequence has the player saying, what have I done, right? Not like, what just happened to me? It's almost like if the negative outcome happens, you want the player, I know it sounds messed up, you want the player blaming themselves. They're like, oh yeah, duh, of course. Like, and I think that's gonna make it feel less punishing. But also risk and reward, there are ratios, right? So a risk reward ratio of 1-to-1 is going to feel a lot more hardcore, right? Like than a risk ratio reward of like 3-to-1, meaning that like if I succeed, I get 3 times, the bonus. And if I fail, the penalty isn't that big versus, a risk reward ratio that is more even. Both the reward and the penalty are going to be, pretty evenly matched. That tends to feel harsher. But it also depends on the vibe of game that you're going for, right? Like some games are a little bit more hardcore on the risk and reward, and some games are a little bit more casual. So whatever type of game you're trying to make, it's probably a good idea to think about, how punishing are the consequences of failing a risk.
That's a really fascinating point. I loved the quote, what have I done versus what happened to me? If the player says what happened to me, that's, well, depending on the design, I suppose. At least for risk versus reward, that's a failing versus what have I done, I think is a success.
Right.
Now, we've reached pretty much the end of the episode, but I don't want anybody to think that I forgot the question of the day, where we reiterate one of the most important points that we learned from the guest for House Cup points. First person to type in chat, what Gabe recommends you do as far as mindset when designing risk versus reward is going to get a House Cup point. First person to type in chat. And if you're listening, speak it out loud for me. See if you learned something from the day. Think about player action. Yes, Christy. Man, Christy has been crushing it on House Cup points. Christy, I assume that point is for House Cleric. You can write it in the chat for me. Yes. Christy says, think about player action. What are the potential actions the player could take on this door? And then what are the different risk versus rewards you can design for them given those different actions? Christy says, yes, House Cup point for Cleric. Cleric is dominating. All right. So we're at the end of the episode. What we'd like to finish with here, Gabe, is a homework assignment. So what is a homework assignment you could give the listener so that they can perpetuate and keep practicing some of what you talked about here today that they can do in the next week?
Yeah. I think one exercise that I think would be a lot of fun is take a single verb, right? Any verb, and try to turn it into a risk reward mechanic, right? So take something like jump or kick or I don't know, talk, right? And map an input to it, and map a risk reward, element to it, and see what you come up with, right? And see and play around with the different ratios, and see what you get. You may be able to build an entire game around it.
That's awesome. Rick immediately typed love into the chat. That's an interesting one.
That's
Awesome.
the ultimate risk.
Yeah, the ultimate risk. Fantastic. So homework assignment is within the next week, Gabe would like all of you to think of a single verb and then figure out what kind of risk reward mechanics you can apply around that verb. If you please do that homework assignment as practice. If you do, post it for us using the hashtag IGLH homework, Indie Game Lunch Hour homework. And we're most active on LinkedIn. So if you want to get a little engagement going on, post about the IGLH homework on LinkedIn. We'll see it. We'll get excited for you. All right, it's the end of the episode. Gabe, is there any last statements you want to make to the audience or anything you'd like to plug here at the end?
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I love what you're doing with the Indie Game Academy. Thank you all for your super insightful questions. I really enjoyed being here. I always love hearing from the next generation of game developers. I am highly invested in you all because you are the future of the game development industry. So if there's any way that I can help you, if there's anything that I can do to help you on your journey, reach out to me. I am at gabrielcornish@gmail.com. Shoot me a question. Anything you need, let me know.
Awesome. That's so sweet of you, Gabe. Thank you. We will include links to Gabe and how you can reach out to him down below in the recording. This has been a wonderful episode of the Indie Game Lunch Hour. I hope you enjoyed listening. As always, we'll be back here Wednesday, 12 p.m. Eastern Time every single week. So come join us on Discord. There's links to join down below. And thank you to Gabe for answering all of these questions. Give a little round of applause to Gabe. Well done, Gabe. And thank you for those who asked questions. And listener, thank you for listening. As always, we ask that if you enjoyed the episode, you send it along to just one other person who might also enjoy. All right, that's going to be it. We'll see you all next week. Goodbye.